Alright YouTube, I was going to do a video on this last night, but it wasn't actually clear what was going to happen. You've got a situation between Senegal and Gambia, and in the latter, their former president has refused to step down, has activated a state of emergency there, and the incoming president, who's been democratically elected, right now is not actually in Gambia because of the threat of violence there. Now this happens every time in Africa, outside of a few countries. Anytime there's sort of an actual election, one of two things happens. There's either massive corruption and rigging, and the ruling party, it's essentially a one-party authoritarian democracy at best, and the ruling party never gives up power by preventing there from being an accurate election. Or if the election goes forward and they lose anyway, they refuse to leave power. It's like Good Luck Jonathan was the first actual individual to cede power peacefully in sort of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the problem is this: there are two sort of long spans of ideology that prevent most African nations from achieving full development. None of them, by the way, have to do with evil racists in the West. One part of it is colonial in nature. Specifically, it has to do with borders. If you look at a map of the world, like if you look at a map of Europe, you'll notice that all the borders there, they sort of coincide with geographic features, with a river, with a mountain range, something like that. Things have been carved up according to sort of a long-held tradition. If you look at a map of Africa, though, mostly what you see are a lot of straight lines. That's because of post-colonial carving up of territory into sort of provincial blocks that the monarchs in Europe thought made sense at the time. They did this in the Middle East too. There's a reason why these are the two most violence-filled parts of the world. A lot of it has to do with people of various tribal backgrounds that were simply conflated together as being all part of one overarching sort of racial subgroup by the Europeans at the time. They didn't really realize, or they didn't care, that some of these tribal groups had more what you would consider European-style borders. Not like they had a map drawn up showing where their land was, but they had sort of the geographically based tradition of what they happened to control at the time. This tribe controls the lowlands, and that tribe across this mountain range controls the next valley over, and then that tribe controls the coast up to the tree line or something like that. And that was ignored by the Europeans when they carved these areas up, both in the Middle East and elsewhere. Like the Ottoman Empire was completely gutted. All of these African tribes were severed from one another or cobbled together, even though along ethnic lines, according to them, they didn't ever get along. They considered themselves totally different people. You have these different dialects that have to coexist and compete, in fact, within some of these African nations. The other problem, though, is older, and that has nothing to do with colonialism, which is that there was never any semblance of representative government in Africa to begin with. That was spawned by Europeans. Now, it was adopted successfully in most of Asia. It was adopted successfully more or less in parts of Latin America. You have some one-party states there too, like Venezuela, honestly, or Brazil. You don't necessarily have the peaceful transition of government, generally speaking. But that was a European thing. So the Europeans came to Latin America, imported the concept of representative government over time, their post-revolutionary period, and it kind of worked. It worked better in some places than others, but it never worked in Africa, and it never worked in the Middle East. The very idea of like trying to transform Iraq, which is one of these post-colonial states whose borders now, they're based on Ottoman provincial systems, with different groups of people with different religious and ethnic backgrounds cobbled together. The idea of then getting them to also adopt a European mode of government, it's just not working. It doesn't work specifically because people vote based on those old ethnic or tribal ideologies. In Africa, it's the same thing. So I'm not surprised. This is African tin horn dictatorships are a dime a dozen. Dysfunctional one-party states that are representative democracies in name only are a dime a dozen in Africa and the Middle East too. I'm not surprised that there's a crisis in the transition of power here, where the old leader simply refuses to step down. Even if we look at one of the so-called more stable African states, we look like South Africa, which has a level of development that's at least better than most of the rest of the continent. And that's not exactly saying much, but it does have, it has factories, it has roads and so forth. And a lot of sectarian infighting among the white minority there that's constantly under hazard. You've got an upstart party right now, sort of the second-tier party that's growing in dominance over time. They're far left, and they're also kind of nationalistic, maybe in more of a violent sense than some of the nationalistic movements that are taking hold in Europe and elsewhere, where people say, well, we want actual functional borders. There it's more like, we've already got a functional border, but there's this minority in our country. We really want to dispossess them of what they own and make life as difficult for them as possible. This has happened also under Mugabe, who made a huge mistake, not because he confiscated white farms under any type of nationalism. Yeah, they can do that if they want to restore like authentic tribal ethnic background to their country, but they handed that land off to people who simply happened to be black and party loyalists who themselves didn't know anything about farming, so their fucking economy collapsed. In South Africa right now, you have the hazard of this upstart movement basically replicating the same thing. All those agricultural tracts that are held disproportionately by sort of the white South African minority who know how to farm, who know how to make that land productive. What could happen is they confiscate it, which is like, whatever, the white South Africans can just go back to Europe and be refugees, if Merkel will let them in, because I know she doesn't like white people. Now, but at the same time, they might hand that land, the means of production would be under sort of their commie-lite system, would be handed to people that simply happen to donate to the party. They don't know anything about farming. They probably can't grow crabgrass, but they're the ones that are going to get control of that land. It's going to be parceled up sort of among the loyalists. They'll talk a big game about, we want it for the people, and we're going to have sort of a syndicated system here where you'll have almost a neo-feudalism. But at the same time, the people calling the shots, they'll just be a bunch of tin horns too. And that's really the problem that you have in Africa. The problem that we see in Gambia here, it has to do with the fact that these borders largely, in many cases, make no sense. I don't think that's specifically the case in Gambia itself, although it is sort of post-colonialism, let's face it. But the fact is that the European mode of representative government that comes in the wake of the monarchists dying off and carving up Africa and the Middle East in the first place, it just doesn't work in Africa. It's not built on African ideology, on any tribal mentality throughout Africa. You have a few states in Africa that have done far better than the others. Nigeria is generally doing fairly well. Ghana is doing fairly well. Ethiopia, untouched really by colonialism throughout most of its history, arguably is doing really well also. Culture is thousands of years old. They give no fucks. They lost control of Eritrea, but at the same time, things there are more stable, it's like they've got Christians and Muslims living side by side for 1,000 years and they don't even butcher each other. It's like the rest of Africa probably should look at the successes of like Ethiopia if they want a more civic system. If they want a more ethnic system, one thing that's going to happen is a hell of a lot of violence, because you have to erase all of those colonial borders that don't make sense, and each individual that is empowered under such a system will be trying to grab up the maximum amount of land that they can, the maximum number of resources to perhaps oppress or suppress, smaller sort of tribal identities. And so you're going to have a freak show. It would explode across Africa. The idea that you're going to have a United States of Africa, it's a totally failed notion. It's never going to happen. You've got too many different dialects, too many different tribal groups that hate each other, too many borders that are still under dispute and have been since they were carved out to begin with. You've got too much bad blood among these people. It's like if the Europeans can't create a United States of Europe because of all of their different cultures and their squabbles and disagreements over whose border ends where, who has the right to determine our immigration policies, if they can't do it despite being under representative government successfully for some time now, and despite the fact that they even got past like the Iron Curtain shit, and now you have a more or less kind of united Europe that at least has an overarching military alliance, you know, NATO. If they can't do it, how the hell is Africa supposed to do it? It's just not going to work. Every time there's a representative government in which the in party starts to lose favor and loses an election because they don't manage to successfully rig it, all you get is bloodshed. The old leader refuses to step down. They're one step away from becoming a dictator. You usually have some sort of pogrom in the country. We've seen this time and time again. It's not a new thing. It's not a rare event when you have the non-peaceful transition of power under military threat within the continent of Africa. It's not a new thing. You've got a sliver, you got North Africa is kind of stable, except when Clinton steps in and assassinates people, or Obama steps in and props up some Sharia-loving group. But at the same time, the rest of Africa, it's just, democracy is not going to take hold there very successfully. You've got tribal, ethnic beliefs. You're not going to be able to force it. You're not going to be able to pull in Iraq and force them into a representative democracy. It's not working there either. Among people that, 100 years ago were under the kind of sort of secular rule of the more enlightened Ottomans before it started to degrade. You just got so many problems. And then you've got the widespread poverty and the widespread other problems endemic within Africa, reducing stability further, and it makes it even less likely that you're going to have a functional representative democracy outside of where it's already taken hold, because there's some degree of human development. Again, you'd think of Nigeria, you'd think of Ghana, some place where maybe people are more interested in soccer or something like that than really fighting over politics. Outside of that, there's not a whole lot in Africa that hasn't been built either by Europeans or by now the Chinese, who are far worse than the European monarchists ever were, and openly exploit these people in places like Tanzania or Kenya. And it's just 1,000 times worse. They're basically using Africans as nothing more than new wave slave labor, to the point at which there are parties there taking hold that they run on a single platform, kick out the Chinese, and they actually win an election in some cases, or come very close to it. So that's the state of Africa today. I'm not surprised that what's going on in Gambia is going on. Yeah, there'll probably be a lot of killings in the streets there pretty soon in what the fuck is the name of their Banjul or something like that. And Dakar is the capital of I can't remember. I believe Senegal, Dakar is their capital, and then Banjul is the capital of Gambia. And Gambia is the little sliver of land surrounded almost entirely by Senegal. So yeah, you got some fucking problems there, and they're going to continue. That's about all. Peace out.